delighted to have Dr. Hilary Morgan V. Latham here today, who I invited. I saw she was at Queen's, that she had just gotten her PhD from Chicago, that she was a poet and anthropologist, and this is a really interesting person. And so I wrote to her on the off chance that she'd be willing to come for a talk, and she agreed. And then I found out that she was also a visiting fellow in MUSI, the Maynooth University Social Science Institute. So I wasn't obviously not the first in Maynooth to take interest in Hilary as a scholar and potential presenter. So I'm really delighted to welcome Hilary here. Hilary Morgan V. Latham is a writer, anthropologist, and visiting researcher at MUSI, currently lecturing at Queen's University Belfast. Previously a digital knowledge sharing fellow at the American Philosophical Society and exchange fellow at the École des Études in Sciences Sociales in Paris, AHAS, let's call it, in Paris. Latham holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago, where they recently completed their dissertation, History Dispossessed, Haunting, Theft, and the Making of Monumental Heritage in Oaxaca, Mexico. Latham's doctoral research explored the ways Indigenous Zapotec and Mixtec stakeholders form social and effective relationships with monumental heritage sites, specifically attending to tensions between state possession and Indigenous dispossession. Their research has been funded by the Fulbright Hayes DDRA Mellon Foundation, Tinker Foundation, American Philosophical Society, and the Field Museum of Natural History. Their academic writing appears in the Archaeological Review from Cambridge, Cultural Anthropology's Visual and New Media Review, and Culture Work, Folklore and the Humanities for 21st Century Public. Latham is also an award-winning poet, essayist, and, this is my favorite one of all, science fiction writer, with their public anthropology essay To Coronavirus C, an anthropological abecedary, anthologized in Best Canadian Essays 2021. And I happen to know that there's much more that I could say, but you're not here to listen to me. So thanks very much, Hilary, for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I have to do it.
Okay. Shall I stand here? Is that kind of whereabouts
I think
need
so.
to be? Okay, thank you. So before I begin, very quickly, I do want to extend my own gracious thanks to first, of course, MUSI and the Department of Anthropology here at Maynooth, such as Dr. Steve Coleman, Donna, Hannah, etc., for both the opportunity to take up this award as a visiting fellow and also the invitation to speak today and share my research. I'd also like to acknowledge that my research in Oaxaca was made possible over the years by the generous support of funding bodies and institutions, such as the Fulbright Hayes, like Steve mentioned, the Mellon, the Tinker, the University of Chicago, the University of Illinois Chicago, and Field Museum. Finally, but most significantly, I want to thank my friends and my colleagues in Oaxaca and in Mitla, who without their generosity, hospitality, friendship, and love, none of this would be possible. So thank you for joining me today. To hear my talk, Looting Made Legal, Settler-Colonial Logics of Erasure and the Making of Phantasmal Patrimony. I think immediately. Is somebody here, does that mean?
It might mean
That's just so nice
someone just joined, I think.
You're all good, or?
You're all good.
Okay. Okay. So just for context, for people unfamiliar with the region, I wanted to throw up a map so you kind of have an idea.
Sorry, Hilary.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello. It goes.
Somebody is
Can you hear me now?
The slides are not moving on Teams. I can see them.
Yes, you can manually move them yourself if it's not showing for you.
Oh, we can.
At the end of the screen there, yeah.
That's perfect. Thank you very much.
Ah, okay, perfect.
Oh, is it Steve? Are you doing that?
I'll try.
So
Yeah,
you know,
look, I can do it.
okay, great.
Bizarre.
Yeah, it's the map. It's a map orienting us towards Oaxaca, so everybody has an idea of where it is. It's in the southern part of Mexico. It has a Pacific border. The place of my research was near the capital, Mitla being 40 minutes east in the valley of Tlatelolco. Okay, and with that we'll begin. The Frissell fiasco, 2006. News across Oaxaca, a state in southern Mexico, spreads fast, especially when it addresses two media favorites, heritage and the government. The urban Frissell Museum, located in Mitla, an Indigenous Zapotec town 45 kilometers east of the city, was sacked overnight. In less than 24 hours, locals claim that nearly 43,000 pre-Hispanic objects housed on the property disappeared, along with the visitor's logbook, payroll, urban Frissell's personal papers, including his will, and various other administrative documents. It must have been strange showing up for work, opening the doors of the museum, and finding nothing but an empty, silent void. What happened? Overnight, Mitleños and the rest of the world lost sight of and access to the most complete collection of Zapotec artifacts ever assembled. It was a local scandal too. Mitleños claimed that the Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia, or INAH, referred to it here, a Mexican state-operated organization responsible for cultural and historical research and heritage, was responsible for the ransacking of their beloved Frissell Museum, and representatives from the INAH immediately countered, stating they had nothing to do with it, or so the story goes. Most people know that 43,000 objects do not simply disappear over the course of an evening without somebody yet noticing. When I first began doing fieldwork in Mitla in 2008, I heard the story of the Frissell over and over again from local friends and interlocutors. At first, I found records of the events in local newspapers. But as time went on, those accounts vanished from the internet, and details on the mechanics of how this event took place were difficult to obtain or verify. How, after all, can so many objects be removed quickly? The absurdity of the narrative escalated when the INAH later admitted it did indeed take possession of the objects, and that they did so within a legal framework. So to quote the director Centro INAH Oaxaca at the time, "We aren't hiding anything." As it turned out, the collection had been moved to Santo Domingo. However, it cannot be accessed by anyone for any reason, including current employees of the INAH or somebody like myself. Moreover, the director had noted that it was the INAH's right to take back what belongs to La Patria, or to Mexico. Pre-Hispanic artifacts, no matter where they're found and whatever community might claim them, are the property of the Mexican state, Patrimony, bound up within the framework of a nationalist ideology, and so an intimate part of Mexico's historical imaginary. As anthropologists ask, to whom does the past belong? INAH threw out the resounding chorus, to all Mexicans. The INAH's answer here is not unique to the Frissell Museum. Over the course of this talk, I'll mark the slippage contained in the INAH's assertion that patrimony at once belongs to all Mexicans, while also being the inalienable property of the Mexican state. This precise legal configuration being a frequent point of tension between indigenous and mestizo communities who live adjacently in the shadows, if you will, of archaeological sites. Patrimonio, or patrimony, emerges here as a polyvalent concept and national project that must dispossess communities in order for the state to possess its heritage. So if the Frissell fiasco seems contradictory, sensationalist, or confusing, this is because its looting is indeed an inchoate narrative shot through with ever-evolving frictions between Mitla, the INAH, and the Mexican state. The fraught constitution of patrimony in Mexico is far from a recent development. Ingrained in the constitution and a holdover from its colonial origins as New Spain, patrimony suffers from an overburden of meaning, not only in a symbolic sense, as Lynn Meskel has pointed out, but in the political, economic, and pragmatic realm. As the anthropologist Sandra Rosenthal writes, the Spanish term patrimonio condenses both its English equivalents, so heritage and inheritance, while also indexing the patriarchal power relations that historically ensured the existence of a Mexican state. The looting of the Frissell, if we may call it that under Mexican rule of law, demonstrates that something's missing in our current understanding of how patrimony operates. It materializes or discloses a conceptual gap or loophole present within Mexican law, which asserts that patrimony is the property of all Mexicans, while seizing material culture and heritage sites as a property of state. And what I mean by this is that Mexican law inscribed state-sanctioned looting into the legal regime from the start by endowing the Mexican state with this ability to intervene in property relations, and by crafting this hierarchy where, at the state's desire and discretion, property can suddenly pass from the private to public realm. In other words, Mexico's legal order purposely and quite cunningly created the conditions for its, quote, monumental ambivalence, to borrow from Lisa Breglia. So long as the looting is done by a Mexican governmental institution, looting is legally eligible, precisely as looting. Not only is patrimony then a paradoxical formation by way of its simultaneously figuring a property as an entity prone to wild and unpredictable oscillations between the public and private sphere, but it's also deeply ironic in that looting becomes the vehicle for the continuous growth and maintenance of Mexican patrimony. The focus here on the Frissell's looting departs from recent preoccupations with what looting technically is, how it works, and why it matters. Colin Renfrew, for example, presents looting as a destructive act that forecloses the production of knowledge. It threatens the Western epistemological machine, which prizes the pursuit of knowledge above all else at the expense of creating a world where our desperate hold to preserve history suffocates the present. Renfrew is not wrong that looting is destructive and must be condemned. However, he misses the mark when he asserts that looting matters simply because it threatens a cogent narrative of the early human past. When he expresses frustration over how looting disrupts the archaeological record, arguing that, quote, such unprovenance antiquities ripped from their archaeological context without record and without any hope of publication can tell us little is new, he's incorrect again, for Jacques Derrida reminds us that absence frequently points to the presence of something larger and possibly more insidious. Indeed, to quote Diana Espiritu Santo and Ruy Blanes, quote, absence paradoxically serves to draw and direct attention to presence or a longing for it, end quote. In the case of the Frissell looting, the unprovenance antiquities are reportedly made on provenance by the INAH in order to facilitate and conceal their looting while making their absence more palpable. The absences and erasures of looting index more complicated social and political processes at work. So while they may be frustrating for archaeologists who are attempting to stitch together histories and paint a picture of the past, looting offers fresh commentary on how patrimony is being made, remade, and mobilized for ends that push beyond mere economics. So looting isn't just a mechanism for the maintenance of patrimony, but it exists to support Mexico's state-sanctioned nationalist imaginaries of itself, which emerged in the aftermath of the revolution as solutions to Mexico's diversity. Elizabeth Ferries argued that the Mexican revolutionary government attempted to remake property relations in order to remake the nation. So building on this, I contend that the remaking of property relations and the remaking of the nation reveals the extent to which patrimony deployed as the linchpin to the implementation of the nationalist ideology, mestizaje, becomes predicated on erasure and silencing. If Mexico is mestizo, a mixture of multiple identities, then all Mexicans can stake a claim to Mexico's revered prehispanic past. Federico Navarrete points out that the category of mestizo is deliberately misleading in his book México Racista, una denuncia, or Racist Mexico. He argues that, quote, the new mestizo Mexicans were neither a product of racial or cultural mixture, but instead represented a socio-political shift that created a new identity that bore more similarities to elite Criollo culture than any indigenous or African traditions. Quote, end quote. What's more, mestizaje conceals racist policies and attitudes by being a racist ideology for a post-racial society. Yet most significantly, it enables all Mexicans, no matter their ancestral background, to feel entitled to be occupying indigenous territory. Again, we'll see the twinned concerns over property and patrimony in all of its forms emerge through the operative lens of mestizaje, and thus the following crystallizes further that looting is required to uphold the nationalist ideology of mestizaje, which, through this incorporation of indigenous people and pre-Hispanic cultures, essentially absorbs and eliminates difference, even as it claims to celebrate it. So what's at stake in looting made legal, or legitimate looting, as it were, is that it upholds this nationalist vision, which disguises the fact that Mexican patrimony is predicated on a logic of erasure that echoes settler-colonial modes of domination. Without sanctioned looting, without these property relations, Mexico could not continue to abide by the illusion, and dispossession and displacement would be thrown into bold relief, and the rights of indigenous communities would have to be recognized. This looting, I suggest, works as follows. The disappearance or looting of objects prefigures the displacement of the communities, facilitating their erasure by forcing them into a cohesive narrative that elides difference at the same time as it celebrates it. So 3 concerns then animate the talk. First, I'm concerned with the violent formation of patrimony. Taking the Frissell looting as my launching pad, I expose patrimony as a fractured concept and project steeped in paradoxical relations and regulations. Second, I trace the affective tremors of heritage making, a process that I take to be simultaneously intimate and disassociative. Grief and anger are entrenched in the stories that follow, regardless of what side of history the actors stand. Third, I'm concerned with how legal looting emerges as a symptom or even a signal of a broader socio-political problem in Mexico that until recently has been ignored because of its instrumental role in upholding the ideological and material structures of this regime. So as such, I take the fraught relationship between the INAH, the Mitleños, and the Frissell as epitomizing a broader set of power relations across Mexico, which, by elucidating, allows us to better understand how debates over who controls patrimony play out on the ground, and how ideologies like mestizaje are experienced by those that they overdetermine and erase. Mexico and other mestizo nations complicate this narrative by claiming diversity, but I contend that they can still be understood as participating in distinctly settler-colonial modes of erasure. Sandra Rosenthal expressed this eloquently, writing, "Unlike in many settler-colonial contexts, where distinct indigenous sovereignties have been formally recognized and can thus use legal frameworks to claim rights and require the repatriation of objects. In Mexico, such claims are complicated by the state's appropriation of indigeneity, and specifically of pre-Hispanic indigenous material culture as a tangible inheritance of all Mexicans." So, far from post-colonial, I'm following scholars then like Maria Josefina Saldaña Portillo, Maurice Magaña, and Shannon Speed in saying that Mexico is closer to a settler-colonial state, and that this particular form of governance promotes the development of legitimate looting or the semi-militarization of patrimony's maintenance. Settler colonialism, as Wolfe has famously argued, is distinguished from modes of coloniality because it's concerned with replacing an existing indigenous population with a new and distinct settler population. In his often quoted formulation, settler colonialism destroys to replace. Here. So in a space such as Mitla, it's its most famous, an image of its most famous archaeological site, the palatial ruins. It is the needs and the rights of the indigenous population that are silenced and erased precisely by the claim that Mexico, as a mestizo nation, has the right to control the patrimony as a whole. The issue is not then the dispossession of indigenous communities from the rights to occupy traditional territories per se, but instead the erasure of their rights to control their own histories and to manage and actually determine the dispossession of both their material culture and then the resource extraction projects in their homelands. This is expressed by the indigenous Mixe linguist and activist Yasnaya Aguilar-Gil, who has argued, quote, "The Mexican state has designed political policies, promulgated laws, and exercised legislative acts in order to erase the existence of other nations and other languages across the country." For Aguilar-Gil, the Mexican state's negation and denial of indigenous individuals as socio-political actors is linked to the state's violation of human rights. She points out how, alongside efforts of erasure, most of the problems that indigenous peoples face pivot on the ways they are inscribed into state projects that are overwhelmingly extractive in nature and harm individuals or communities. The state projects, which attempt to harness a number of resources ranging from wind energy to minerals and petrol, they operate under a logic of Patrimony that dispossesses and displaces indigenous peoples through their violent mechanisms. Ruins and artifacts are also patrimony, and heritage projects in Mexico are contentious state projects, given that the INAH, though far from monolithic, is the embodiment of Mexican state power in the culture sector. So this is all run by INAH, right, and it's gated off from the community. Most importantly, though, wind minerals, petrol, and artifacts are all resources to be extracted and absorbed into a Mexican state that is underpinned by racism and active dispossession. Settler-colonial governance relies precisely on theft, silencing, and other forceful acts of erasure. Looting, I posit, not only raises Rioian questions over power and the production of history, but it's a deeply relational project, and it possesses material, temporal, and affective implications. Taken together, these concerns point to an inescapable haunting. Looting's logics of silencing, erasure, and extraction generate absent presences and exchange presences for absent. This illicit and shrouded activity, which may be referred to as an example of a phantom economy, leads me to suggest that we're dealing with a deeply speculative heritage in Mexico, or phantasmal patrimony. No one knows exactly what patrimony is, what it should do, how it should work, or to whom it really belongs. This is further exacerbated by rigorous yet capacious legislation that leaves ample room for open interpretations. In other words, I think of patrimony as phantasmal in that it only generates regimes of invisibility, as Monica Salas has argued, but produces, materially and discursively, absent presences and present absences, which transform human relations. So too, patrimony creates genuine accounts of specters and hauntings. What I referred to in this article in this talk as phantasmal patrimony then, has antecedents that are Derridian, and thus in direct conversation with the emergent literature of ontology, but it also takes attack from the anthropology of history. The conceptual architecture of patrimony might be thought of as constituted by ghost stories, in the senses given by Stefan Palme and Eric Gordon. All histories, Palme reminds us, are ghost stories, insofar as they're concerned with elision, absences, and gaps. History is inherently ambiguous and liminal. Since patrimony is in part one figuration of the materiality of history, it suffers from fissures and silences. Patrimony, then, in this iteration can be viewed through the prism of Michel Roche-Trujillo's burden of the concrete. We'll never escape the matter of the facts, nor can we ever fully excavate every sedimented story deposited around us. Given this bottomless silence contained in monuments, artifacts, and fossils, haunting proves inescapable. With Mitla's Frissell fiasco, then, as the springboard, I'm exploring these concerns from multiple perspectives. I'll begin now with the Frissell and the mystery of its vanished collection, to query whether or not the collection's provenance documents were destroyed by the INAH, which is a significant local rumor in both Mitla and, as I discovered, among some heritage sector workers. I then turn to the effective impact of the collection's looting, with experiences of Lenshaw as my center, and will conclude by considering the implications of this form of phantasmal patrimony. The Frissell Museum is a sensitive topic. Its unraveling, presented here as a synthesis of ethnographic and archival fragments, can be traced to a cast of rotating mutual misunderstandings about how patrimony ought to work and to whom it should really belong. I tried to talk to multiple senior Oaxacanists about both the creation and the looting of the Frissell, but most queries received no response. The knowledge that I have about the Frissell Museum and its collection comes from interviews with members of the Mitla community, such as Lenshaw, Nina, Pilar, Manuel, or Jairo, or from junior Oaxacanists. It's also worth reiterating that many of the articles that I refer to here are not absent from the internet, having been pulled offline at some point. I only will have access to them because of the assiduous archiving of a friend over the years. At a glance, Irvin Frissell was a typical expatriate, an American businessman born in Minnesota, raised in Wisconsin, and an admirer of Mexico's art and archaeology. He moved to Mitla in the 1940s and purchased what was formerly a dry goods store known as La Sorpresa from the Quiro family with a small fortune. He reconverted the building back into a hacienda, and this is what eventually became the museum. And here's a photo of the collection. Immediately recognized as an aficionado of pre-Hispanic art by the Mitleños, Ron de Boulotte has recounted how Frissell offered money to anyone who would deliver artifacts to him. Children spent time digging around the Arroyo group, a crop of ruins by the river, with wooden sticks in hopes that the ground might reveal caritas, or little faces, which Frissell would gladly accept, offering pennies in return. Besides these caritas and these sherds, Frissell acquired classic and early post-classic period Zapotec effigy vessels and urns. These are what these are, which were offered to him by families and individuals who were storing the artifacts in their homes or who had clandestinely excavated them. After amassing this impressive collection of pre-Hispanic Zapotec and Mixtec material culture, Frissell died on the 16th of November, 1959. His friend, another American expatriate and scholar of Mixtec language and culture, Howard Lee, continued to acquire and add pieces to the Frissell Museum, growing the collection for several more decades until his own death in 1979. Frissell reportedly left behind a will, and I use the word reportedly because the INAH claims that there was no will, and says that even if there had been a will, it was never a legally binding document, and the attorney who helped him draw it up was deeply ignorant. Frissell's death notice on November 17, 1959 says that he bequeathed his collection to Mexico City College, an English-speaking junior college that became the University of the Americas, and then later split once more. Senior Oaxacanists and multiple sources confirm this to all be true, that Frissell's will designated Mexico City College as the steward of the collection, and it also stipulated the collection must never be separated from the building in which it resides. So, although Frissell left this collection in the hands of another institution, his will made explicit the desire of the collection to be inalienable from the land on which it sits and the building in which it's stored. In other words, the collection must never leave Mitla. Yet, this is obviously not in the cards. The INAH's looting of the Frissell involved alienating the collection in the name of patrimony, the inalienable property of the Mexican state. And unlike most accounts of theft that use the word robar, a verb that denotes obvious illegality, both locals and news articles deploy the verb saquear when speaking of the Frissell looting, which is a word connoting extraction. It doesn't necessarily imply legalities, but it does mean to take out with force or in another violent way. I've been warned earlier that the Frissell was almost impossible to unravel. How, my friends and colleagues wondered, could anyone make sense of a legitimate looting that revolves around an empty space, the museum, always about to open, in a narrative that features the black holing and burning of documents? So too, more confusion abounds with a statement by the former director of Mitla's archaeological zone, Jorge, when he claims that the Frissell situation is not contentious, stating, "It's a private property that naturally converted into public property." Wherever more details are needed or desired, they're purposely obfuscated or obliterated. Did the Frissell become the Mexican state because he died and left it to an educational institution? To wit, the collection may have been passed on to Mexico City College, but the archaeologist John Paddock presided over it, choosing to utilize the collection as an object of study and site for training future generations of Oaxacanists. If the will says the collection must remain in the museum in Mitla, why does this document suddenly cease to have legal teeth? And moreover, if this collection was once the domain of scientific studies conducted by Ignacio Bernal, Alfonso Caso, and other luminaries of Oaxacan archaeology, why extract it from the community and hide it away? So who is afraid of the INAH? Perhaps Urban Frissell was afraid of the INAH's authoritarian powers to dispossess, so this is why he's left behind a will like this. Or perhaps he wasn't afraid at all. I would reckon, though, that this is the wrong question to ask and can only lead down a narrow path. Perhaps the correct version is a modified inversion of the former, which appears in a more recent news article out of Oaxaca, which states, "What is INAH afraid of?" After all, why else would the institution go to such great lengths to create such epistemic murk? In order to pose answers to these two questions, I'll quickly recount some details of the looting alongside the actual sacking, in which I was told that the collection was put in gigantic black garbage bags and placed in the backs of pickup trucks after midnight. Frissell's will and accompanying documents disappeared. Quote, "You will never get too far trying to understand the Frissell, or really any projects that we might label as failures or disasters," warned a colleague at the Museo Textil. A man named Victor burned the papers in the Frissell collection that explained how they were acquired and detailed their provenance. I'm uncertain what the motives were, but heritage is a battlefield here. Objects are pawns, but so are people. What happened to the collection's documentation? Friends both in Mitla and positioned in various heritage sectors told me the papers were burned. And yet, I'd also been told that as a constituent of the INAH, my friend disavows the notion that the papers were destroyed. My own efforts to access said papers proved fruitless beyond John Paddock's archive, which is split between the San Pablo Cultural Center in Oaxaca and the University of the Americas Puebla Library. What's most interesting to me is not whether or not the papers really exist, about which I do remain somewhat uncertain, but rather the social work that is done by the idea that they have been destroyed. Whether or not the papers exist somewhere, they are not readily accessible to either local community members or scholars. Their absence forecloses the opportunity to engage with the INAH directly, making it impossible to contest the looting of these objects from the Frissell or to directly address the sense of violation that this looting engendered. These violent acts refigure an illegitimate act into a legitimate one and generate the epistemic murk that plagues any discussion of the Frissell, its accompanying collection, and its associated relation. Colin Renfrew reminds us that looting can be combated by the refusal of institutions to collect unprovenanced antiquities, writing, quote, that a pedigree is needed for any acquisition. Likening provenance to pedigree, we see that the provenance of objects or a collection is an intimate and a critical part of their biography. In some ways, it conjures up notions of origins, kinship, and ancestry. This pedigree is required for acquisitions, and it's the backbone of legal transactions. Meaning, this is necessary information when staking claims of legitimacy. It's also required for proof of authenticity. And as Lisa Breckley details, provenance is a, quote, record of the ultimate derision and passage of an item through its various owners. What does it mean to destroy a pedigree, or at the very least, to imagine that a pedigree has been destroyed? I prefer Renfrew's term here as it highlights perceived personhood of these objects and avoids imposed dichotomies. From the perspective of Mitleños, destroying the pedigree is an intentionally transformative, oppressive act. Knowing that a pedigree is needed for legitimacy and authenticity, it seems counterintuitive for the INAH to erase this information. Yet, this is essential to the INAH's task. It must reconfigure Frissell's collection into loot, into something illegitimate, so that the INAH's own looting of the Frissell can be legitimized. In so doing, the INAH also creates a symbolic death of sorts, or even an unmooring. Destroying the pedigree or the biography of these objects makes it impossible for anyone to illustrate that this is a looting. When the INAH eliminates the pedigree, morphing the material into something unprovenanced, it also erases previous ownership, symbolically cutting Mitleños off from their heritage, and de facto erasing their existence. Here, the death in this biography indexes a new social life of the Frissell, rather than the possibility of the collection's future return to its original, rightful Mitleño owners. The symbolic death in the unmooring manifest as an alternate return. This is an unsettling return that hangs like a specter over the heads of the community and the state at large. So reborn in this form, the Frissell collection occupies a site of liminality, the return endlessly oscillating between what might have been and what might come to happen if the correct conditions emerged. So spatially and temporally, the collection comes to exist in a kind of mythic past, a contentious present, and a potential future that is always seemingly foreclosed. The erasure, whether material or procedural, of the Frissell's collection's pedigree achieves two things. First, it eliminates the previous legitimacy and authenticity of the collection and reinforces the authority of the Mexican state's actions, rendering contestation moot. And then two, the erasure serves as metonymy for the erasure of Mitleño pedigrees. So put another way, it undercuts ancestral claims to land, and it prefigures the state's erasure of Indigenous communities within a legal framework. So as such, the INAH set out to create a condition of social and semiotic ambivalence that is seemingly incomparable to the ambivalence Lisa Breckley speaks of in her monograph. So rather than ambivalence just being a myriad frictions that are generated between multi-scalar conflicting heritage policies, which are recognized by the state and other parties as legitimate, ambivalence in this context is purposeful. And it results from the grafting or the layering of exclusions. We might even say that the INAH has consciously produced a series of convenient silences in the story of the Frissell in order to avoid any question of legitimacy. It appears that the INAH is afraid of exactly this, any question of its legitimacy and thus any challenges to its authority. I wouldn't be the first person, though, to impute this. Luis Vasquez Leon's Archaeological Leviathan, he critiques the authoritarian structures of this scientific institution, outlining how it is an extension, of the Mexican state that's historically abused its power. Whether or not we can determine the truth about the Frissell's looting is not the point here, because this may never be achievable. Instead, what we're confronted by is the ontological clash between the INAH's federally mandated power to control the narrative and Mitleño accounts of history or stories that are politically rendered as rumor. As Trujillo once put it, power enters here obviously and surreptitiously. So now I'll read an excerpt from one of my field notes entitled, I Will Not Tell You the History, from January 23rd, 2018. I returned to Mitla this past Saturday. It was blistering hot, and Mina, my dueña, who runs a bakery off of Zocalo, told me that there are only a few people left who had worked at the Frissell. She and her daughter Pilar laughed about how I was 2 days late. The sweet old man who'd worked there and was a close confidant of Frissell was buried 2 days ago, and then died a few before that. So they exclaimed, what rotten luck! I pushed him on the fact that surely he couldn't have been the only person left in town who was both a former employee and willing to chat. Then INAH made a noise of exclamation. There's Lencho. He's the man outside the market. He's there all the time. He lives in front of it. Pilar and I headed to the market. When we arrived, Pilar pointed to a crumbling adobe structure that literally had a hole in it for a doorway. I think this is his place, she said. The man that was Lencho quickly burst out of the hole with a stick in his mouth. He was short, with a mustache and a ruddy complexion, and his white polo had a bunch of holes in it. Who are you? He barked at Pilar. I'm Pilar, Joel's daughter. My family owns the Panaderia. You know? Ha, Lencho laughed. Pilar and I exchanged looks. I present to you Hillary, she said. I've never seen you, and I don't know who your family is, and you bring me this gringa, Lencho snapped. He would have none of it. What do you want? Why are you with her? Pilar decided to ignore the question and just cut to the chase, asking him if he'd indeed worked at the Frissell. Lencho nodded and explained it had been for about 12 years, but that he was nothing more than a custodian. He was, quote, nothing more than a guard. Although, he pointed out animatedly in the midst of the conversation, he spent a lot of time looking after displays, exhibition spaces, and the contents of the vitrines that hugged the white walls of the Frissell and stood as creolized temporal centerpieces in the courtyard, pre-Hispanic effigies and caritas imprisoned behind manufactured wood and glass. Lencho finally said to me directly that he will not tell me a thing until the government returns the collection to Mitla, its rightful home. I tried to explain that I wanted to understand the history of Mitla, particularly the history of the Frissell and the Mitleño relationship with it, but it didn't matter. Go talk to a historian, he snapped. I listened to him tell a story that he said, me molestó mucho, or bothered me very much, about Nelly Robles, who used to head Settler-Colonial, Oaxaca. He was bothered by how Nelly asserted that according to some, quote, made-up chronology imposed by random scientists, how other archaeologists do precisely this, that the Mitla Palace and its ruby ruins were not actually Zapotec, but rather Mixtec. Apparently, Nelly had come to Mitla in the 1990s when Lencho was still working at the Frissell and talked to Mitleños about their patrimony. She told the community that according to the timeline in Oaxaca, evidence pointed towards a Mixtec occupation during Mitla's opulence, meaning the ruins were not made by them. This obviously rubbed locals the wrong way. Quote, do you know her? He yelped as he finished. I remained silent as he would not like my answer. He said, gesturing at me. She was awful. All of you are awful, thinking that you know everything. We stood in silence again for a minute. He's like, I only worked there for 12 years, he said. Yeah, but that's a lot of time, I repeated. He shook his head. Come in, come in. He motioned to the hole in the adobe wall. Pilar and I exchanged another look and we went in together. Once inside, Lencho sat down at his sewing machine and put down the stick he'd chewed on. He fumbled through an enormous pile of newspapers that bordered the entire wall next to him. The stack measured nearly 3 feet high. And he pulled out a clipped news article. I'm not telling you anything until the collection's returned. I've told you I'm a student. I don't even have a PhD yet. I don't have that kind of power, I responded. I'm not telling you anything, he said again. Then I guess it's settled, I said. I guess that we'll just forget the histories. Is that for the best? Lencho was thinking. I'm not telling you anything, he sniffed, sitting back down in his gnarly wooden chair. Okay, I capitulated, but you need to know I'll help in any way that I can. I don't understand why you want to know about the museum, he said, and I don't understand why you don't care about the objects stolen. You saw, I spoke about it, the government stole from us. I know that the INAH took the objects, I said, and I do care. I just can't do anything. I don't even think that those objects will come back. No one knows where they are. Ha, he snorted. Dirty institutions. They forget that we're mestizo too, except when we're not. I was silent for a moment and he rocked back and forth. I had no response to the comment. Why do you care about these stories? He reiterated, or about our history, and I mean Zapotec history. You know that the past does not exist here. Yes, there are the ruins. Yes, there's archaeology everywhere, but the youth don't care for the past. It's forgotten. They don't know what it means to be Zapotec. He was red now. All forgotten. And who knows? This history too should be forgotten. He gestured in the direction of the Frissell. Without the collection, we have nothing. There's a lot at stake, I responded in remembering. Lencho gave me an exasperated look. I won't tell you the history. And then, like the Zapotec past, this past will be forgotten. I don't care. Did Frissell do something wrong? Or John Paddock? I asked. John Paddock was the Frissell's last curator, and with whom Lencho would have spent quite a lot of time working with. No, he snapped quickly. He looked away. Paddock was a gran hombre. He was very good to me. He would have not allowed this. Ha, the people at the INAH, they wait, then they strike, and they take it all when there's no white person like you to protect. We can protect it ourselves. So that's the end of the field note. There are multiple layers to unpack in this interlude, which is taken from my field notes, but before anything, I wanted to highlight the degree to which grief is deeply palpable. As I've suggested, the looting of the Frissell engenders multiple deaths and disconnections. It's, in short, a fundamentally relational mode of possession and dispossession that kind of leaves these melancholy affects in its wake. As we witnessed with Lencho, affective ties to the collection, building, and its figures, they provide the illusion of physical links to Mitleño pasts. These are then reconfigured in such a way that this response to loss or the keening over absence permeates and it reinforces social bonds and binds between Mitleños. I describe grief as a keening over absence because it emphasizes how the emotion hinges on experiences of loss in all of its forms. What the Mitleño case illustrates is that there's another sensory element in the mix, the act of silencing, which points not only to a textual silencing, but to stifling of voices. Lencho speaks up about the Frissell and he speaks loudly, hence my choice of keening. And although I'm not interested in applying psychoanalytic terms to the Mitleño situation, which feels dangerously like a diagnosis, I see grief in this context as a kind of inescapable, affective part of mourning designed to help humans grapple with loss. This grief, I would contend, was not Lencho's alone. Rather, it was shared by many of my friends and interlocutors in Mitla whenever the Frissell came up. Quote, INAH is the enemy. You can't trust them. We had heritage and now we don't, remarked Andreas, a local artist, to me. In this way, grief is one of Mitla's most resonant structures of feeling. And if grief, figured as a keening over absence, becomes the community's connective tissue, we can see further how absence and all of its manifestations structure Mitleño lives. So too, it points to the growing sense of exile in the wake of the unmooring that legitimate looting brings. Exile might impart the notion that one has been banished or isolated physically, estranged, if you will, but this is exactly what has happened to the Frissell collection. And thus, just as the collection is estranged from Lencho and the Mitleños, likewise, they perceive themselves estranged from these material receptacles of history. Yet I also posit that this is not solely a grief about the loss of the collection, which is constituted by vessels representing and linking Mitleños to their ancestors in the past, but about the loss of of Mitla's cultural advocates like Howard Lee or Paddock or Frissell. Two sides of the same coin, both of these griefs or grievances are inextricably intertwined, and one presages or compounds the other. David Scott wrote that, quote, the force of the sense of loss will be all the more compounded where the ideal is already personified, already invested in the body of an individual, a beloved leader say, and where the loss of that ideal is at the same time the concrete death, perhaps violent elimination of the idealized person. The potent affective power of grief in Mitla stems from how they experience these two losses. First, there's the death of Frissell, who's a local figure that symbolized multiple things. One being the adoration of Zapotec art, culture, and history. Two, access to the traces, the material traces of said history by way of his museum. And three, a setting apart of Mitleño patrimony from the rest of Mexico's industrial heritage complex. The last point, perhaps, is particularly important, as Emil Durkheim reminds us that the act of setting apart is a declaration of significance and sacrality. To this end, however problematic Frissell's position of steward might be when we look back on it, he had cultivated a distinct set of social and affective attachments to Mitleño patrimony that encouraged the communal sense of pride. And this is distinct from Mexico's uniform project of mestizaje. Rather than the patrimony belonging to all Mexicans or even all Oaxacans, the museum and its collection kind of made Mitleños feel like it was exceptional and theirs alone. If anything, the Frissell Museum and Frissell himself they personified ideals of ownership and possession over heritage, which aren't rights extended to individuals or communities in Mexico. So upon Frissell's death, stewardship passed on to Howard Lee and then John Paddock. The collection in the Frissell was left behind by the death of its appointed and foreign stewards. Obviously, it may have continued to reside in the Frissell if it had not been for the looting, which amplified the sense of loss and the mourning precisely because after the death of Lee, Paddock, and Frissell, it became synonymous with the former. Since Frissell had promised that his death would herald the inauguration of a new kind of Mitleño cultural stewardship, the loss of the collection is experienced as an absence. Here, the violent elimination that Scott refers to is the sacking of the collection, the forced removal of numerous heritage objects that were at the center of a series of contemporary and historic social and emotive relations. The INAH's looting made the potential for closure, like a healthy mourning, impossible. It also revealed that Mitleño patrimony was not exceptional. It belongs with everything else. The rightful heritage of the mestizo nation. Mencho's immediate embodiment and expression of ambivalence in his encounter with Pilar and myself provides further commentary on the relations unraveling around the Frissell collection in the museum. The last living employee of the Frissell, Mencho appears jaded and resentful, while at the same time, he seems invested in having some kind of conversation with a person, so myself in this example, who represents a form of authority that both the Mexican state and indigenous Mitleños recognize. However, Mencho's recognition of my presence and subsequent knowledge is stalled, granted, and recanted in an almost theatrical, performative way. What may appear on the surface level to be a man who is simply exhibiting refusal, disavowal, and a whole host of ambivalent emotions discloses itself to be about a set of broader concerns. The stakes of Mencho's story lie in his unknowing performance of Mexican state authority when he's confronted with the memory of the Frissell in a conversation about patrimony. Mencho will nuances structural regimes and tactics of settler-colonial governance when he simultaneously recognizes and refuses my presence, rendering me absent, silent, and however briefly, worth a few moments of his time, due to my positionality, which places me within an uncomfortable realm of racialized expertise. Amidst his stacks of newspaper clippings, quips, and irreverence for the INAH, he inverts and reiterates the very structures that enable the existence of these conditions that marginalize and delegitimize indigenous Mitleño rights as he enters into a relationship with a foreigner who he endows with an authority premised on coloniality. They, INAH, wait, then they strike, and they take it all when there's no white person like you to protect it. Briefly undercutting his own statement, Mencho enlivens the ambivalence of settler-colonial relations, pointedly illuminating the infinite fault lines intrinsic to the landscape that mestizaje has made. The construction and maintenance of patrimony in Mexico demands that white expertise and ownership, while simultaneously promulgating the belief that patrimony is for all Mexicans, no matter their background. They forget that we are mestizo too, except when we are not. The nationalist project of mestizaje is just a tattered veil between worlds. Here, Mencho exposes the frayed fabric of Mexican society and pulls it back for all to see. Yet, despite Mencho's efforts to unsettle the structures governing his life, and that made the looting legitimate, the absence so keen, he rearticulates and resettles these structures through requesting and thus presuming that I can return the collection. This return is a return of state power in a phantom form. Without full cognizance, we wound up participating in a form of social exchange designed to reinforce asymmetries of power. Conclusion. The Frissell Museum's looting and accompanying biographies are morally dubious. This is further amplified by the evolving moralities of the 21st century. It's a result of archaeologists, anthropologists, and the public becoming cognizant of or sensitized to the violent constitution of patrimony. There can be no preservation without plunder, remarks the British collector in Alonso Ruiz Palacios' film Museo, which is a modern retelling of the notorious 1985 looting of Mexico's own National Museum of Anthropology. The fact that the groundwork for the formation of archaeological knowledge is historically bound to destructive acts of colonial authoritarian regimes is well acknowledged. You can see Nadia Abu al-Hajj's work, for example. Looting makes nations, and Mexico recognized, along with countries like Turkey, Egypt, and Greece, that the protection and thus preservation of its patrimony was essential to the project of modernity. The Frissell fiasco throws a wrench in previous heritage frameworks because its contents or its web of relations and acts of looting are not only constantly redefined and resignified, subject to the sheer passage of time to conflicting legal regimes and multiple jurisdictions, but because the theft is made legitimate through illegitimate means. From the symbolic deaths of the museum and its collection to the death of Irving Frissell himself, the specter haunting this looting resurrects questions of stewardship and belonging through the language of extraction, phantoms, and imminent returns. Historically, preservation distinguishes itself from looting by achieving legitimacy through legal means. Collecting in order to preserve is a scientifically endorsed excuse to extract patrimonial objects and land from local indigenous communities who, more often than not, have refused permission. As such, collection and preservation are manifestations of an ambivalent sentiment that affectively pulses with admiration and pride, or great love for my country, to quote Carlos de Signienza. But it's tainted by these insidious presumptions and futures that it belies. Writes Enrique Florestano, quote, during the 17th century, this interest in the preservation of the indigenous past became part of the growing criollo compulsion to identify themselves with the soil on which they lived and with the remote past of its original inhabitants. The Mexican state imagines itself in popular and civic discourses as the direct successor to the Aztec Empire, mobilizing symbols from Aztec myth and legend, such as the famous snake ensnared by an eagle on the flag, in order to strengthen ancestral links to the past and legitimize the continuous occupation and wresting of indigenous land for nationalist interests. Preservation and legitimate looting become mechanisms for the maintenance of a cohesive state, and they remain entangled at this juncture unless indigenous communities like Mitla were to accept the narrative of mestizaje and grant the state permission to steward patrimony. But, as Lancho and my friends in Mitla have made clear, they have no intention of doing this. In the absence of any real permission, Mexico must instead mobilize patrimony as a double-edged sword that seeks to bring the nation together through, ironically, cleaving them apart via cultural theft and extraction. In other words, this nationalist construction of patrimony as both shared inheritance and the exclusive property of the Mexican state relies on co-opting pre-Hispanic pasts and claiming them as everybody's through processes of silence and erasure. As Yasnaya Aguilar-Gil has argued, the mere existence of indigenous peoples is a threat to the Mexican state's imaginary, since the objective of the mestizaje ideology was to make indigenous peoples disappear through fake miscegenation. What is at stake in recognizing legitimate looting, then, is not simply the flouting of global forms of patrimonial governance, but rather the maintenance of a distinctly settler-colonial mode of domination. Kehalani Karanui, building on the scholarship of Patrick Wolf, contends that settler colonialism unfolds through a set of constitutive paradoxes, and it's exactly these paradoxes that serve as the cornerstone of settler colonial regimes. The Mexican state's relationship to its indigenous populations and with its own configuration of patrimony is riddled with paradoxes. The ability to legally loot pre-Hispanic patrimony is essential to the nationalist project of mestizaje, which operates paradoxically by way of it being premised on homogeneous heterogeneity, or a nearly fantastical notion that every citizen is the result of racial admixture, when this is not the truth and unattainable given historic and socioeconomic conventions. When a community protests against seizing patrimony, it's refusing the project of mestizaje, subsequently shattering the state's image of itself as a cohesive nation. This then translates as a threat to the Mexican state. Legitimate looting in the Mexican context allows the dispossession and displacement of indigenous communities at the expense of a nationalist agenda, further crystallizing Mexico's translucent settler colonial structures. Patrimony, premised on the silencing of difference in order to make a nation that sees itself as exactly this, distinct and different, becomes caught in the throes of a Dravidian double mind. To be present, it must create absences, and these absences persist and they reverberate into the future, reminding communities of former presences. Absence operates or is achieved through the acts that I gestured to: silencing, erasure, looting. But what the Frissell illustrates is how one form of absence begets another form of absence. It highlights the extent to which Mexican patrimony and property claims require the disappearance of Indigenous peoples in tandem with the continued presence of their material accomplishments. Looting thus becomes an absolute necessity. It achieves settler-colonial objectives by reinscribing patrimony as an ambivalent domain, one that belongs to no one and everyone. Yet, looting also does something more otherworldly. While it's true that other scholars have observed heritage to be an inescapably paradoxical and multifarious formation, and you can see Kirsten Black-Gimblett and Lynn Meskel for this, few have acknowledged that these characteristics are what also figures heritage as a concept and practice that's rooted in spectrality. The persistent tensions between past and present, absence and presence, possession and dispossession, they manifest phantoms and they lead to rumors of haunting. It would be no coincidence then that the ghost of Frissell is said to roam the building and its surrounding land. This said, it was stressed to me that this account of an apparition only appeared after the looting. Mitleños interpret the haunting as a mode of return that is waiting for another, more imminent return, which is the reacquisition of the collection. Scaling up from these two returns is the hope for a different kind of return, but one that's gestured to often, the return of land. The notion and a mode of experience of imminent return defines settler colonialism in Mexico. Imminent return in light of looting and other forms of theft and erasure solidifies heritage, an already spectral or speculative project in many contexts, into something inexorably phantasmal. To briefly recall Lencho's story, the grief that rips through its metaphorical pages is no other than an effective fallout. Lencho realizes and sensuously experiences a future that never comes, but might possibly arrive if the correct conditions can ever be met. The incessant waiting, coupled with the constant generating and exchange of absent presences, or present absences for that matter, structures Mexican patrimony, and perhaps heritage more broadly. Looting creates the conditions for haunting. Yeah, it's a good I found. Thank you.
Working great. Okay, so thanks very much for that wonderful talk, and you could just take a seat if you like anywhere, right, we'll open the floor to questions. Yes.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. So, I was thinking about that idea of like wanting from the future, and maybe that as a resistance to this idea of domesticity. I wonder what kind of future do you think is haunting? Like, how is that haunting conjured collectively by the presence of the Frissell Museum just being there left empty? I suppose I wonder if you could speak more about
like, I'm sorry, I just want to clarify. So you're curious about how they envision haunting, like the kind of temporal, the future.
Yeah, like the future is now basically like an object which allows a kind of conjuring of the future,
Sure.
Because it's of its emptiness and lack of those objects.
Yeah, I think the Frissell collection, right, as a former presence, that they're kind of like haunted by the memory of it. So the sort of the future. So if you imagine like haunting as a kind of temporal spectrum, there's like the what has been, there's like the what might be, what's happening in the present that hasn't quite come, like it hasn't quite, manifested, as it were. And so the future part of it is that kind of like, so like I'm thinking through mostly like Mark Fisher, for example. If you read his like What is Ontology, it's a really great piece, and I would recommend it to help you get through this. But it's an imagined pale future, something that like hasn't yet arrived, but people would desire to, right? Or they could be fearful, right? There's like different kind of affective tenors that are attached to this. So in the context then of Mitla, when we're speaking about like haunting from the future, it's the kind of notion, right, that they would like the collection to return. It's that thing where it's a sort of like conduit, you know, to their past. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for the question.
Right. Anyone else? Questions? We have a hand up here. I think it's Jamie. Is it? Yeah.
Yeah. Great talk. I really liked it. Although I think I would like to maybe follow up on the previous question about haunting. I mean, in the reverse of the Sixth Sense, I don't really see dead people here. I kind of see much more of a discussion about, I mean, something very close to Sapir as genuine and spurious, because I think there's a temporal axis that was suggested by your main consultant, that the youth don't care, and it just seems to me that what the collection was itself collected in a very, shall we say, unconventional way, right? Paying pennies for kids to dig stuff out of the ground is not according to Hoyle, as far as, you know, archaeology is concerned. But what happened was that there was a sense of, this is mine and ours, while the materiality was there, and the alienation of that is experienced as, you know, what's being replaced, or implicitly what is now, what was occluded by this local relationship, is a spurious kind of identity of a mestizo kind of, you know, that no one feels it's available to. So I think that might bridge some of the, I mean, you strayed a little bit into grief, and I even sensed maybe you wanted to say Freud and melancholia, a kind of but you kind of steered out of the dark woods of psychoanalysis very quickly. But it strikes me that genuine and spurious for Sapir does precisely that in a moment, because of historically contingent circumstances, things can be shared, they become available for both collective and kind of individual forms of community and self-creation simultaneously. But there's always that kind of sense, like the youth don't care. You know, the question about Zapotec and Mixtec is really quite interesting, you know, and, you know, like, are you there to tell them that the things that they want back weren't the real things, you know, weren't what they thought they were? You know, I mean, so it just seems to me that you're seeing a kind of discussion about sharing and co-creation as much as you're kind of seeing or hearing a story about loss and possible return. I think you hear it very clearly when your whiteness is, well, if you were there or somebody like you might get it back, but then we don't need you. We'll do it ourselves. You know, it will belong to, you know, not only will the collection belong to us, but the work to get the collection back is also our project. And it just, I mean, I like hauntology, but I think hauntology is good. It has been written a little too much for any kind of gesture to the past or a question of absence. And it seems to me there might be more close to the discipline ideas that might be useful there, but that's just a suggestion.
Thank you very much, like Jamie, for your comment. I've taken a few notes on that because I had not actually previously thought of it through what you just gestured to there, like the lens of co-creation, which is, it is interesting, I think, to kind of go back and rethink that part of the argument. I will admit that I do just really very much enjoy hauntological literature, so there's a bit of that. But I'm also always, like, I am more interested in, I think, it as a sort of like futuristic, like temporal figuration in that way. Thank you. I appreciate it.
I've done some work recently about an amazingly similar situation in some ways. It's an Irish intellectual named Martin O'Kine who came from the Irish-speaking West Coast, and he wrote this incredible polemic against the discipline of folklore in very similar terms. The situation is quite similar, where folklore is collected by the Irish state as its national patrimony, but is alienated from local communities and all of that. But O'Kine's the main thrust of his critique was that he basically said, you're collecting the wrong stuff. The stuff you're collecting is dead. Why aren't you interested in the living stuff and all that? And there's a wonderful evocation in this oration, which caused a riot when he delivered it in 1950. Police had to come and clear out the room. There's this wonderful sense of how uncanny this folklore is. Because he's from the communities in which it was collected. In fact, he collected it himself. So the stuff is alive and dead at the same time. And it's better to put it out of its misery. Don't preserve it in a kind of artificial life in an archive and all of that. So there's a strange sense of, and hauntology is really good for describing that sense of creepiness that O'Kine, really viscerally felt, when confronted with this stuff. Is it alive or is it dead? And all of that. And so what I wanted to know basically is the people that you worked with, that local community, how do they feel about the objects themselves? Did they feel that way about the objects? And I'm wondering, could that, it'd be interesting to think also what they felt their role or relationship is to these, Zapotecs. Do they say that's us, or do they say that's something in the past and our only link to it is these objects or whatever? And I think for O'Kine, the creepiness of folklore had to do with the fact that the communities actually still existed. So exactly like you're saying, we haven't gone away, and that makes this even creepier and all that. So what's going on there? Is it similar?
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So are you, I just want to make sure I understand all parts of the question. How did the community feel about the objects? Do you mean, did you think, are they alive?
Yeah, what kind of presence do they have?
Vitality? Well, I don't think from what let me think of how I'm going to answer that. So the collection's been gone for almost now at this point, 20 years. So that's the last time that people would have engaged with it. But I do think that there's, people are of two minds there, generally, depending on who you're speaking to. Some people in the community feel very much this doesn't really matter. They walk past this empty museum all the time without it even, without a single thought, about the collection. And that when archaeologists arrive, or anthropologists, or even if they themselves are in their backyard, if they've exhumed something because they've been gardening and here's, suddenly an effigies in front of them, some people take the opinion where it's just that they do ring INAH. They just say, hey, can you please take this off my hands? It doesn't mean anything to them. Yeah. And then there are families too, right, who take a different, tack. They find some kind of value in it because it's a link, to their past. I've never actually really gotten a sense from people that they think of the creation, the artifacts themselves, the effigies, the vessels or urns, as being vital objects. They don't contain spirit. Instead, if you go all the way back, the kind of general, the local, from what I understand, kind of indigenous Zapotec cosmology imbues the landscape as being animatistic, right? As everything in existence contains a host of spirits or energies that are also simultaneously deities or ancestors or whatever. So it's very, very, very complex. And actually, I just finished writing a grant that would really get me back to kind of create a sort of Indigenous Zapotec lexicon out of these terms. So that's hopefully me answering one part of the question. And can you remind me the second part?
I can't remember.
Oh, sure.
It's basically, who do they feel they are in relationship to the people who made the artifacts? That's kind of the question.
Yeah, also very kind of conflicted things. I mean, on the one hand, there are people who feel like these really are that they themselves are the direct antecessors, that these are really direct links. Right. And then there's some who just are sorry.
Hunting.
Are entirely just dismissive about it, that they don't feel that that they need any of these things to connect them to the past. But most people identify, I'll say, in the community as either being like Indigenous Zapotec or mestizo. But mestizo, has a very complex kind of
Yeah. But in what I'm talking about, the time depth is much shallower. Like we're really talking about a generation or two back, rather than the time distance that's involved between the Zapotec state or whatever it was and the current day Mexico.
Yeah.
So that's a huge difference, really. Think that.
It is.
Yeah.
It's an interesting one, and at least some of the artists that I was working with do feel very directly linked back to the Zapotec state, and are very proud of the fact that in the former. So if you go back 500 years, you had Montalban, you had the political center, which was based right outside Oaxaca City, and that's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And then Mitla's ruins, which I showed you a photo of. So Mitla was important in ways on the map because it was the house. It housed an oracle. It was the most sacred site in all of Oaxaca and within Zapotec cosmology. If you identified as Zapotec or you were a member, then you died, and when you died, your soul got deposited in Mitla. So it's the land of the dead, because Mitla is from Mitlan, which is the Aztec for land of the dead, but then in Zapotec it's Leoba, or the place of souls.
Right.
So it's literally like a stratigraphy
Yeah.
of souls. So again, because of the kind of Christian elements that have been introduced, some people who identify as more Pentecostal there, they don't want this link with the past. And I kind of, in some of the translation work I've done, repatriating some of the documents from Elsie Cruz Parsons' archive, when they're Pentecostal, they actually don't want to touch some of the material that's about that. But when they're more kind of folk Catholicism, kind of like my own family, culturally Catholic, but that's it, they're fine with it. So I think it just depends, on how the person identifies.
Right. Great. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
So,
It's called hands.
Yeah, there's how many hands we have Araby Smith, we have Thomas Strong, and we have 3 people in the room. Let's do Tom, yours was up the longest, I think.
Yeah.
It's a really simple question, but you sort of answered it, but I'm going to repeat it, which is who are the indigenous people? I don't know much about Oaxaca. So when you use the term indigenous peoples, what does that mean? Who are they in this area?
In the context of Oaxaca, or specifically in the town?
Specifically, in your paper, when you said indigenous people, what did you mean? Who were you speaking about?
Yeah, so when I was, I'll definitely, thank you. That's a very good question because it allows for some clarification. So when I was quoting from that indigenous Mihe, linguist and activist Yasnaya, who she's written a lot of cultural criticism about Oaxaca, and she identifies as a member of the Mihe, and the Mihe are kind of based off in a totally different part, of Oaxaca. So Oaxaca is basically the second most indigenous state within Mexico, and it's constituted by multiple different indigenous communities, and these include the Chontal and the Chatino, but the major ones are Zapotec and Mixtec. And so I was working in Mitla, which identifies as mostly indigenous Zapotec. So when I was using the term indigenous, it sometimes was referring collectively, to all the different, communities, that existed in Oaxaca, but then also within the bounds of, or at least related to the Frissell, I mostly meant Zapotec. Yes.
So then I was sort of interested then in who doesn't get included in the Zapotec indigenous, but who might be included in a different indigenous. If you see what I mean, in respect of this patrimony and so on.
Yeah. I think when the patrimony specifically, when I'm referring to the collection, it really does just mean the Zapotec. But when it comes from, because that's the Mitleño perspective, it's theirs, it's their heritage. So they're thinking of it as the material culture, the materiality of a kind of Zapotec history. But in the context of Mexico's own definition or figuration of patrimonial or patrimony, then that gets, hugely expanded, right? Because suddenly it's not even just the indigenous communities in Oaxaca, but suddenly all of Mexico, right, is taken into consideration. It gets kind of like, collapsed, right, within the balance framework of the patrimony. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, might as well stay online. So Araby Smith has a question.
Hi, thanks Hillary for your talk. My question is, or what I wanted to ask you to talk more about is, do you, like, from your position as a researcher, as someone coming from the United States and working in Mexico, what kind of feelings did you get about like learning about like the kind of, I guess, colonial past, its place in the present, as a researcher, learning about like other maybe archaeologists, researchers, and people that came before you in the same place? Like, I was just wanting to hear you talk more about that, because I have also worked in Oaxaca and have experienced this, like, hearing of the stories of the people that came to do research before me, and it really like influenced and has like shifted how I think about myself as a researcher in that region.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Arlie. Thanks for being here. Yeah, so I think I've always found, because kind of what happened at the beginning of my field work is that I started off as an archaeologist, in 2008, and that was, nobody really ever spoke to me, right, about the people who kind of like came before me per se. But when I did switch into sociocultural anthropology and identified as an ethnographer and then returned to Mitla, there was a way in which people started to compare me to Elsie Clues Parson, who was like, a Boasian anthropologist in the 1930s. And I kind of had like very ambivalent feelings about that because of her reputation when she was working with, in the Southwest. But there was this way in which they were very like, keen to do that, to sort of map me or map her onto me. It was very jarring. And I think that as I learned more and more about how all these different kind of historic figures who'd worked in Oaxaca, how they had behaved, what their ethics were like, because for me, like, the major thing was the lack of translation that had occurred, or the dissemination. I went on to, want to engage in projects that were more like participatory, or that involved kind of like the return of stewardship in some ways. So while this article, I think, doesn't really this talk too, it's a forthcoming article as well, current anthropology. It doesn't like really talk about that. It only just kind of glides over the sentiments I've had as someone who's been interrogated, like my whiteness or whatever. And I feel like I'm babbling, but what I mean to say is that the ways in which they have linked me to various figures has made me want to do projects like the digital repatriation that I'm doing, because I'm a fellow at the American Philosophical Society, where I'm like translating these documents, right, that came from Elsie Clues Parsons with the help of my friend and my colleague, Guillermo Ramon Solis, and then somebody at the Cultural Center named Marco Mendez. So we're just kind of like returning and transcribing documents. So Oaxaca has a very, like, I guess, fraught, history, like any place. And so I think it's up to us, like in the present, to sort of reconcile, like to kind of fix these power asymmetries that have occurred, right, as people who come in and find ways to give back. So
thank you.
Okay, so 2 questions in the room, and then Katja remote after that. Yeah, just your.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh,
so you partly answered to my question, but for those who are claiming to be the heirs of the Zapotecs, is this heritage just an identification, or did you observe it in their way of living, like to the colonial context took them?
Sorry, can you repeat your question?
Yeah. For the people claiming to be the descendants of the Zapotecs, did you observe that this heritage was just in their identification or also in their daily life?
I mean, I think I hope I'm understanding your question correctly. And let me know if I'm wrong. But so I just sort of, the attitude generally that one took during fieldwork was that if somebody tells me that this is how they identify, that they're a member, that they consider themselves to be a Zapotec background, I take their word for it. I'm not going to, discriminate, or try to figure out, if they really, really are. And, in Oaxaca, especially, the Zapotec language, for example, which you could think of, right, as a marker of somebody's identity. It was sort of, it didn't quote unquote go extinct, but it was slightly endangered for a while. And there's been a sort of revitalization, right? Linguistic revitalization. So that's I don't know, is that?
Yeah.
Sort of, yeah.
Thank you. So I was just, I thought the way you were using Patrick Wolf was really striking. And just thinking about, his sort of well-known formulation that the invention is a structure, not an event.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if they're experiencing the structure of settler-colonialism through, the Mexican state's appropriation of Mexican land and so on over all these years. But did this particular thing, did this event actually, you think it was perceived as, they could see the structure of it, condensed into that event?
Yeah.
That overnight translate.
Yeah, I guess I hope I'm gonna understand your question correctly, Chandana, and let me know if I'm not answering it. But I do think that they saw that the Frissell event itself, right, could be seen as shedding light or as illuminating, the structures that I was talking about. I think it used to be the case that we would think of Mexico as a sort of post-colony. And then more and more literature, more and more scholars have argued it is indeed, we think it's settler-colonial, or kind of looks that way. And I just think it's interesting because this is a context where it becomes more settler-colonial because of neoliberal demands. If you think of tourism and stuff and housing. And so I think in this instance, with this paper, it's that, this emergence of the settler-colonial logic, we can call it that, is entwined, right, with that semi-militarization of patrimony. Yeah. Thank you.
And Katya, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. Does it work? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks so much for this. So I think it takes us a little bit further, what I'm thinking about, but sorry, I'm hearing myself back. I hope you can hear me well. You were speaking about, this whole kind of difficulty of indigenous communities being kind of absorbed into the idea of the mestizo, of everything becoming one, and obviously, the Mexican state is very much kind of building its identity on that, right? Being kind of this one people with a shared kind of heritage. And at the same time, the Mexican state has changed its constitution to become a multicultural state, right? I think early in the 2000s or something like this. So I was just wondering, and I think I would like to hear a little bit more about that, if you have looked into that, how the contradiction between kind of these absences, the material culture being absorbed, so to say, right, into a wider mestizo culture. And the struggle to get it back and make it proper indigenous, kind of how that interrelates with the ideas of rights and the constitutional rights, as well as kind of the right on identity being placed in place, right? I mean, we were speaking about, the collection should not leave the museum space. So I was kind of wondering if you looked at it a bit from the legal side and what kind of impact that has on these discourses around identity making and community making. I'm sorry, I'm really hearing myself back, so I hope it worked. But...
No, thank you. I can hear you more or less. You cut out a little bit, but I did hear the gist of it. I think you're asking me to elaborate more on the sort of legal side of things.
Yeah, because I think there's a very interesting contradiction in kind of the idea of allowing more space for the diversity of the cultural diversity within Mexico and writing it into the constitution and into the making of the state, while at the same time you're speaking about, those material cultures being absorbed into kind of the wider Mexican heritage and the struggle against the state, so to say, in order to gain it back and to become indigenous and to find your own place. So I was just wondering about these kind of absences creating communities and how it relates to the legal documents that are in place.
Well, on the first hand, the patrimony itself, I think in Mexico could be understood as a completely paradoxical formation, right? In order for the state to possess, it must dispossess. But I don't necessarily, I think what would be a satisfying answer for you, the person I would actually recommend reading on this, which is kind of who I cited a few times, would be Yasnaya Aguilar-Hugh, who she wrote this really brilliant essay called Nosotros y México, Naciones Indígenas y Autonomía. And it's from 2018. I think you can find it online. But it's where she's arguing that the Mexican state abides by a policy, of integration where the inclusion of indigenous peoples is actively sought out while their participation, in society is denied or negated. So what I have a quote from her actually right in the back that says it's necessary to create a Mexico that does not absorb or standardize the we, a state that does not have the ultimate goal of integrating indigenous peoples into that fabricated ideal that has come to call itself mestizo. So you might find that, I think, very interesting for me. It really was provocative and it helped me think through some of these issues. But I apologize that I can't completely answer your question, but I would steer you towards her body of work, I think. Thank you.
Right, anything else? Anyone else? Here or there?
Actually, I wondered about the word loot. What does the word loot mean?
What?
Loot, L-O-O-T. What's the etymology of loot? And are there other terms that are relevant? Am I talking over somebody? Sorry, I was asking about looting and what that word is. It just occurred to me. I don't really know much about it.
I mean, I'm not a linguistic anthropologist, but we have one right here. But I think so loot, right? I'm imagining it comes, or I mean, if we go all the way back, apparently the word booty. Wait, is this related to British colonialism in India? I think it is. But there's an actual link here. But at least in the Spanish context,
we have the word in English too.
To loot? Yeah. Oh, that might be where it comes from.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't think about this.
I looked at the OED entry, and there is something to do with Sanskrit. But I mean, I was wondering specifically about is there archaeological loot is a thing, right? It's somehow that is a thing. It's a conventional usage or something. And I wonder just what the talk would sound like if you said appropriate or something along those lines. It changed. That would the tenor of the argument change? Why loot specifically? Legal looting, you know what I mean? As opposed to legal repossession or legal appropriation or something.
You mean rather than theft? Or
theft? Yeah, sure. Or theft. I don't know. I just wondered about this word loot.
Yeah.
Loot is booty. It's like what you get when you invade someplace, you take loot. So, there's
as well.
Yeah. And I think the reason I chose then the word, I mean, this must be why I chose the word loot, was not just because that's the one that automatically comes up in most of the discourses in heritage studies, but I think it is because when I was dealing with the Spanish, right, the verb, or they described it, the event, as a saqueando, or from the sacar, which is to take or rip violently.
Sacking.
Yeah. So it just felt kind of like weird to call it legitimate sacking. I don't know.
Isn't it more extractivist than just stealing?
Yeah.
And it has more colonial over undertone.
Because I think I pointed this out near the start of the talk, that, it would be more gentle, like I hate to use that word, if in the Spanish they were using robar, just like to rob. So this was the way, I think, to convey that kind of extractive but violent quality, of the action of the event. Yeah, thank you.
Do you know, is there anything written generally about the kinds of people like Frissell represent? Like it's really interesting. They're semi-professionals. There's so many of them. Like Rob Moore wrote a really interesting article about a guy whose name I can't remember, I can't remember what his name was, who collected Native American linguistic stuff all the time and was deathly paranoid that Edward Sapir would steal from his collection, and all of this really, really insane people like that. And then there was a guy, what's his name? Jeremiah Curtin, who did the same thing both in Native America and in Gaeltacht in Ireland. He was a total amateur, but went around basically collecting, and like it was very colonialist kind of thing.
Yeah.
So these people are everywhere.
They are.
And what, has anyone theorized them generally? Because they're in a weird remove from state projects. Are they parasitic on state projects, or is it the other way around? It's interesting to think about them.
I actually have, there's a part of my dissertation, actually, I think it's the first chapter, that talks a little bit about the collecting or the violence of the collecting. But there's a great book, and it's by Adam Sellen, I think, who called Orphans of the Muse. Orphans of the Muse, where, and I think it's from, the book must have come out in the last 3 to 5 years, but it is all about theorizing collection, the active collection in Oaxaca specifically. So he looks at the biographies, right, of all these different figures, and talks about the relationships to the pre-Hispanic past, and also to the communities, and how they were perceived and how they behaved in often very immoral, unethical ways. So there is some material, but I would say for the most part, I feel like a lot of people haven't, at least through anthropology, touched upon that, even though it's really interesting, because that's from the Romantics, right?
Yeah.
Were of that.
It's very romantic, yeah.
Yeah.
I know Angela Burke is writing a book about Jeremiah Curtin right now, but maybe it's finished already. And he was a really interesting, a really weird character, and there's all kinds of strange politics going on in there. And I think hauntology is probably appropriate to talk about the psyches of a lot of these people. It seems to come up again and again. They're haunted people, in particular ways, and they bridge this weird continuum between people who are totally professional scholars and people who are, random lunatics, basically, no affiliation with anything other than themselves.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
They did say. So one of the people who had been charged with the preservation, but also the restoration of those ruins that you saw, the Mitla archaeological site, was Leopoldo Vázquez. And he was famously kind of a bit of a egomaniac and lunatic. He inscribed his name into those ruins in gold. So that gives you an idea of how power hungry. So he's simultaneously revered and hated. So they're complex. He wasn't really a collector either, right? He was the inspector general, of antiquities in the original formation like what would become the INAH. So an important figure nonetheless. But yeah, you can read about him more in like Orphans and Remused, and like apparently he got into some kind of weird spat. Like I had a newspaper clipping somewhere where I think he fought with not D.H. Lawrence, but yeah, there's some other like it's an interesting. Yeah, we can talk about that for hours. I'm sure. I'll leave it there. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, is that last chance for any more further interventions? We should let more women go. Okay, so thanks so much, Hillary, for coming and talking to us, and really wishing you a very successful time as the Mossy Fellow.